Rikers Island's most infamous gang members explained. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. The riot that spoke for everyone. At 6:13 a.m., the lights in the Robert N. Davern complex flickered, just long enough for a few hundred inmates to realize the officers had lost control of the block. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs faded to silence. What came next was the sound that defined Rikers Island: metal against metal, fists against flesh, and a dozen voices erupting at once into a storm that the correctional staff couldn't contain. According to Department of Correction reports from 2021, the dorm that morning was housing more men than it was built for. 85 inmates packed into a space meant for 50. Only 3 correction officers were assigned to the unit, one of them new, still learning the rhythm of the place. Inmates called that dorm the Pit, a name that carried its own kind of prophecy. When the lights came back on, the floor was already wet with blood. A fight between 2 inmates from rival sets of the Trinitarios gang had turned into an all-out assault. Homemade blades, shanks carved from toothbrushes and sharpened metal bed frames, flashed in the chaos. In less than 5 minutes, 9 men were bleeding, 1 was unconscious, and another was dragged under a bunk to hide. Officers didn't enter right away. They waited for backup, as they'd been trained to do. By the time they came in wearing riot gear, the dorm looked like a war zone. The smell of bleach mixed with sweat, the walls marked by fists, the air charged with a tension older than any one man in the room. That morning, a name was written into Rikers Island's unofficial history: Pete. He wasn't the loudest, or the most violent. He didn't lead a set, didn't wear beads or colors. But in a place where everyone was looking for protection, Pete had something more dangerous: the ability to unite enemies when it benefited him. The making of Rikers Island's hierarchy. To understand Pete's rise, you have to understand what Rikers really is: not just a jail, but a world suspended between city politics and survival. It's where teenagers awaiting trial share space with men facing life sentences, where rival gang leaders run gambling rings, and where violence isn't random, it's regulated. According to New York City Board of Correction filings, gang affiliation drives over 70% of assaults within the island's facilities. Each building, each dorm, even each phone, has ownership. The Bloods dominate much of the adolescent housing areas, Trinitarios control sections of the West facility, and Latin Kings maintain influence through older, connected inmates who've survived more than one bid. The Nietas, smaller but disciplined, hold pockets of power through loyalty rather than numbers. Guards, officially known as correction officers, or COs, often find themselves caught in between. Some cooperate with gang leaders, others turn a blind eye. The DOC's Internal Affairs Bureau has recorded multiple cases where officers were found smuggling contraband, including cell phones and drugs, in exchange for peace inside their units. Rikers is not a place where order comes from rules, it comes from fear. And fear, Pete understood, was a currency. Pete's first lesson. Before Rikers, Pete was a kid from Mott Haven, the Bronx, a neighborhood already carved by poverty, housing projects, and a code of survival that didn't need to be explained. His father had done time at Rikers in the 90s, part of the Bloodhound Brims, one of the many sets under the Bloods umbrella. His mother, a nurse, did her best to keep him away from that path: Catholic school, curfews, church on Sundays. But as Pete would later tell investigators, you can't pray away the block. When he got arrested at 16 for armed robbery, it wasn't the crime that defined him. It was where he landed. Rikers Island. He was placed in the RNDC, the same complex where the riot happened years later. Back then, it was already infamous for violence among young inmates, a reputation made public after the death of Khalif Browder, whose wrongful imprisonment became a symbol of everything broken about the system. Browder's story had shaken the city, but inside Rikers, not much had changed. The Department of Justice's 2014 report called it a culture of violence, especially among adolescents. Guards used excessive force, inmates ruled the dorms, and rehabilitation was more myth than method. For Pete, that environment wasn't a warning, it was training ground. The Bloods, read inside concrete walls. The Bloods at Rikers are not a single entity. They're a federation of sets: 9 Trey, Sex Money Murder, Bloodhound Brims, Mac Bala, GKB, Gangsta Killa Bloods, and more. Each has its own hierarchy, rules, and lineups. A 2022 DOC gang intelligence report noted that the Bloods accounted for nearly 40% of identified gang members on the island. They control essential items, phones, commissary, and access to protection. To survive, non-affiliated inmates often pay what's known as rent, cigarettes, snacks, or phone time, just to exist in peace. Pete didn't join immediately. He watched. He learned who talked too much, who acted out for attention, and who made decisions quietly. He noticed that while most people feared the 9 Trey Bloods, they also resented them. They ran the phones, but they brought too much heat, constant searches, lockdowns, and beatdowns. So Pete made his first move, not by joining a set, but by playing the mediator. When a fight broke out between a Trinitario and a Blood over stolen commissary, Pete stepped in. Instead of letting it escalate, he negotiated peace by offering up something valuable: information. He'd overheard that DOC officers were planning a surprise raid on their dorm that night. His tip-off allowed both sets to hide their blades and stash before the search. That moment bought him something you can't buy with fear: trust. Trinitarios, brotherhood born from the streets of the Bronx. The Trinitarios, originally a Dominican street gang formed for protection in New York prisons during the 1990s, became one of Rikers' most structured groups. Their members move with discipline, often identifying by green beads or bandanas. Unlike other gangs, they operate less like street thugs and more like soldiers. "Everything is by rule," said one former Rikers inmate in an interview with the city newspaper. "They'll cut you if you disrespect the code, but they won't move unless it's approved." Inside Rikers, their leadership, known as La Junta, meets discreetly, usually through coded messages passed along the phones. Their alliances shift depending on who controls the tier. Pete observed that while the Bloods dominated through numbers, the Trinitarios operated through structure. To him, both were flawed: the Bloods too loud, the Trinitarios too rigid. He began borrowing from both. He built connections, offered favors, and protected the weak when it benefited his reputation. In a place where names are currency, Pete started to mean something. Latin kings and nietas, the old guard. By the time Pete had spent a year on the island, he'd learned about the Latin Kings, one of the oldest and most organized gangs in the U.S. prison system. Their founder in New York, Luis Felipe, known as King Blood, had built an empire that extended into every borough. Though their numbers at Rikers had diminished by the late 2010s, their influence remained. The Nietas, meanwhile, operated on loyalty to Puerto Rican heritage and a code of brotherhood that predated most newer gangs. They didn't recruit as aggressively, but their word carried weight among older inmates, especially those doing long sentences and awaiting transfer upstate. Pete used them as neutral territory, middle ground between factions. When deals went bad or debts couldn't be paid, he went to the Nietas tier to settle matters. It was there he learned that survival in Rikers wasn't about who you stabbed, it was about who you could talk to after. The Riot revisited. When the riot broke out years later, the one that opened this story, Pete wasn't a scared kid anymore. He was 24, serving a short state bid after violating parole. But this time, his name carried weight. According to DOC incident reports, he was the one who stopped the riot from spreading beyond the dorm. While officers struggled to secure the block, Pete ordered both Blood and Trinitario members to fall back. Witnesses later told investigators that the chaos died down when he spoke, not because they respected the officers, but because they respected him. Pete's influence wasn't born from leadership titles or gang hierarchy. It came from understanding Rikers' language of survival: when to fight, when to talk, and when to stand still. That day, the officers found him sitting alone on his bunk, blood splattered across his shirt, not his own. He didn't say a word as they handcuffed him and led him out. In Rikers, silence can be the loudest form of power. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. The business of violence. By the time Pete returned to Rikers in 2022, the island had changed, but not for the better. The city promised reform, but inside the walls, the system had evolved into something that didn't need official control anymore. The gangs had built their own government. According to New York City Council oversight reports, more than half of all recorded assaults inside Rikers that year were classified as gang-related. Yet what most people didn't understand was that gang violence wasn't random, it was business regulation. Each fight, each lockdown, Each stabbing was about control over a product, a debt, or a phone. The cell phones, small, hidden, priceless, were the arteries of the underground economy. And Pete had learned to make them beat. The economy nobody admits exists. Every inmate on Rikers has needs. Cigarettes. Weed. Pills. Razors. Phones. Food better than what the cafeteria serves. The Department of Investigation's 2023 corruption probe revealed that much of it comes through the staff, correction officers who smuggle contraband in return for cash or promises of protection. Inside, everything had a price. A working smartphone could fetch $2,000 in commissary credits. A pack of Newports, $100. A cup of ramen noodles, $20. Most transactions weren't about money, they were about control. Gangs like the Macbala Bloods or Trinitarios would claim certain dorms as their stores. No one could sell, borrow, or even trade inside that zone without permission. The DOC's gang intelligence unit called it shadow governance. Inmates called it survival. Pete positioned himself where few could, between the systems. He wasn't leading one set or another, he was managing the connections between them. If a Trinitario needed a phone from a blood-controlled block, Pete arranged the deal. If a Nieta wanted protection from a rival, Pete negotiated the rent. He didn't take sides, he took percentages. He'd learned early that inside Rikers, loyalty had an expiration date. Power came from being useful, not feared. How power is built without a weapon. Violence was a language, but information was the dialect Pete spoke best. He had friends in every tier, lookouts, cleaners, kitchen workers, even a CO or two who owed him small favors. One of those officers, according to the city's 2022 investigative report, had been suspended for failure to report contraband. Pete made sure the man's name never came up in inmate gossip. In exchange, he got access to the inmate movement schedules, who was being transferred, who was on lockdown, when the searches were planned. With that kind of knowledge, Pete could control the flow of every hustle on the island. And it wasn't just about smuggling. Phones meant contact with the outside, girlfriends, families, street soldiers, money transfers. The Trinitarios used them to coordinate Bronx operations. The Bloods used them for recruitment and intimidation. Pete used them for balance, to keep communication flowing, but chaos contained. Every empire inside Rikers ran on one principle: control the phone, control the people. Extortion, the rent of the weak. The weakest inmates were the economy's backbone. New arrests, scared kids, men without sets, they all paid to stay safe. Some paid to sit at certain tables, others to walk freely through certain tiers. The term used was insurance. A 2020 Rikers investigative hearing described it as protection for rent schemes, where inmates were forced to pay weekly through commissary credits. Pete once told another inmate, later documented in New York Post interviews with former detainees, that money don't keep you safe here. People do. Pete turned the extortion economy on itself. He taxed the taxers, demanding that a percentage of every protection fee come through him. If someone refused, he didn't send muscle. He sent information, whispered rumors, leaked plans, quiet chaos that could turn allies into enemies. No one wanted Pete talking about them. It worked. For the first time, rival gangs stopped fighting long enough to trade. They didn't call it peace, they called it business hours. The guards who looked away. On paper, Rikers had hundreds of officers. In reality, many refused to show up. The New York City Comptroller's audit of 2022 revealed that absenteeism among correctional officers reached nearly 40% in some units. The result? Inmates ruled entire housing areas for days without supervision. Surveillance footage reviewed in that audit showed gangs enforcing their own discipline, punishing members who broke rules or disrespected elders. They'd drag someone into the showers, beat him unconscious, and dump him outside medical. Pete didn't approve of the violence, but he understood it. Without order, there was no economy. And in Rikers, money, or what passed for it, was the only form of peace. The Bloodhound Network. One day, a blood-set leader named K-Bone sent for Pete. He'd heard that Pete was brokering deals between rival factions and wanted in. K-Bone controlled the jail phones in the Otis Bantam Correctional Center, the most dangerous block on the island. He wanted Pete to run commissary exchanges and outside money transfers through his people. Pete agreed, but under one condition: he wouldn't belong to anyone's set. K-Bone laughed, called him crazy, but eventually respected it. Pete's neutrality made him valuable. Within months, he was known among inmates as the ghost broker. He'd never flash colors, never claim allegiance. But when a fight was about to erupt, he was the one both sides listened to before swinging. How drugs moved in the shadows. While the public focused on the violence, the real power flowed through contraband networks. Pills like Suboxone and K2 flooded the jails, smuggled in by corrupt staff or visitors. Some were mailed in, soaked into sheets of paper that inmates smoked later. A 2023 federal task force report found that over 70% of overdoses inside city jails traced back to synthetic drugs smuggled in this way. Pete didn't deal drugs directly, that was too visible. He managed distribution logistics, which dorms got which drops, who could resell, and how payments moved through Cash App or commissary swaps. It was corporate crime without corporate titles. Every trade was logged in memory, every deal backed by reputation. One broken promise, and you didn't need a knife, word spread faster than any blade could cut. When the system crumbled outside, the city was under pressure. Activists demanded Rikers be shut down by 2027. The mayor promised reform. But inside, the island was already evolving into a self-contained city. Electric outages, staff shortages, flooded cells, these weren't exceptions anymore. They were routine. In 2022 alone, 19 people died in custody, according to the New York Times. Investigations blamed negligence, poor medical care, and staff corruption. Pete saw all of it and adapted. He began keeping notes, coded entries in a smuggled notebook. He wrote down which guards looked away, which gangs kept order, which dorms collapsed first during blackouts. Not because he planned to expose it, but because information was his insurance policy. If Rikers was going to implode, he wanted to control the narrative when it did. The meeting in the yard. It was a cold February afternoon when Pete did what no one thought possible: he called a meeting. Representatives from the Bloods, Trinitarios, and Latin Kings met in the yard under the pretense of a basketball game. According to accounts later shared with a DOC investigator, the meeting was about power sharing. Pete proposed what he called the triangle. Each group would control specific commodities, phones, drugs, and protection, and split profits instead of fighting. For months, it worked. Violence dropped in those dorms. Commissary trading soared. Guards were relieved. The DOC even cited it as unexpected stabilization in their quarterly report, unaware that the peace came from the inmates themselves. Pete had become something Rikers never produced before: a neutral power. The betrayal. But peace doesn't last long in a place built on paranoia. One night, Pete's closest ally, a Trinitario known as Chino, was caught with a phone. Under interrogation, Chino broke, claiming Pete had arranged deliveries through corrupt staff. The admission triggered a facility-wide raid. Officers tore apart dorms, confiscated dozens of contraband phones, and transferred Pete to solitary in the West facility, known as the Box. Official records confirm a large contraband seizure in March 2023, though names were redacted. Inmate gossip filled the blanks. Pete's legend only grew. From his 6x8 cell, with nothing but a bunk and a toilet, he watched as everything he'd built fell apart. But he didn't panic. He prepared for it. From solitary, he found ways to send messages, through food trays, laundry, even Bible pages. The network lived on, even if he didn't walk among them. For the first time, Rikers had a businessman instead of a warlord. And everyone, Bloods, Kings, Trinitarios alike, owed him a favor. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. The Fall of the King. They said Rikers Island doesn't remember names, only numbers. But in 2023, one name kept echoing through its corridors, whispered by inmates, repeated in roll calls, scribbled in confiscation logs. Pete. The inmate who had turned chaos into commerce, fear into structure, and enemies into partners. The one the guards couldn't control, because he'd learned to control them instead. But on Rikers Island, every balance eventually tips. And when it did, it wasn't a rival gang that brought Pete down. It was the system itself. The investigation that no one wanted. In early 2023, following a wave of inmate deaths and public outcry, the New York City Department of Investigation, DOI, launched a probe into systemic corruption and gang infiltration within Rikers Island. At first, it looked like another political performance, one more headline to appease the press. But this time, they had something tangible, a phone. During the raid that landed Pete in solitary, officers confiscated a smuggled Android device from a Trinitarios associate. What made it different from the dozens of others wasn't what was on it, but who it called. Investigators traced several messages and financial transactions linking that phone to an officer in the Otis Bantam Correctional Center, and from there, to Cash App accounts registered under civilian names. One of those accounts sent money to a woman in the Bronx, Pete's cousin, according to DOC visitation logs. The dots connected themselves. The contraband economy that had kept Rikers running through shortages wasn't just inmate ingenuity, it was an organized supply chain. According to federal court filings from 2023, 2 officers were later charged for smuggling cell phones and synthetic drugs into the facility in exchange for payments coordinated by inmates. Their names were redacted, but among inmates, it was known, Pete's network had drawn federal eyes. The same skill that kept the peace had now drawn the fire. Inside the box. Solitary confinement on Rikers isn't just isolation, it's psychological warfare. Pete spent 23 hours a day in a 6x8 concrete cell. No TV. No calls. A small window facing another wall. The air carried the smell of sweat, bleach, and silence. But Pete's mind was restless. Through the hum of fluorescent lights, he replayed every move that led him here, the alliances, the trades, the moment Chino broke. He knew he couldn't undo it. But he could make it count. Using a smuggled pencil stub and torn Bible pages, Pete began documenting everything, the smuggling routes, the guards' complicity, the shifts, the secret transfers. He didn't know whether he'd ever get out, but he wanted a record. Something that proved that inside this forgotten island, power was never about violence, it was about survival through organization. It wasn't long before one of those notes made its way out. A cleaner, another inmate serving a short bid for parole violation, smuggled a few pages out in his shoes during laundry duty. The papers made their way to a journalist who'd been covering Rikers for the New York Times. Weeks later, a headline appeared. Inside Rikers' underground economy, inmates speak on corruption, control, and survival. The article never mentioned Pete by name. But every inmate on the island knew who'd written it. The fallout. The exposure triggered a wave of panic through the ranks. DOC officers went silent. Internal Affairs launched what they called a targeted review of gang influence. Contraband seizures doubled overnight. But with every raid, with every confiscation, one truth became clearer. The system had relied on the very people it condemned. Without the underground economy, Rikers couldn't function. Phones kept inmates calm. Drugs kept them sedated. Informal power kept dorms stable when officers didn't show up. Pete hadn't broken Rikers, he'd made it work when the city couldn't. According to a 2023 Board of Correction hearing transcript, one official even admitted, "There are inmates managing order better than we are." That was Pete's victory, and his curse. He'd become the symbol of both corruption and control. Reformers saw him as proof of institutional collapse. The DOC saw him as a scapegoat. And his fellow inmates saw him as legend. Whispers from the outside. Word spread fast beyond the island. Podcasts. TikTok clips. YouTube commentaries, all speculating about the ghost broker who allegedly united Rikers gangs under one code. Reporters called him the invisible king of Rikers. Activists called him a product of systemic neglect. To Pete, those were just words. He'd once said, "Rikers don't make monsters. It makes reflections. You just see what you already were." By mid-2024, Pete's name appeared in leaked court documents under an alias. Prosecutors described an inmate-led coordination cell responsible for smuggling and internal peacekeeping. No charges were filed against him, the DOC had no proof beyond inmate gossip and encrypted messages. But he was quietly transferred to upstate correctional facility, away from the city, away from his influence. He'd escaped indictment, but lost the only kingdom he'd ever built. The silence after power. In upstate, Pete's legend became folklore. Rikers inmates told stories about the men who ran a prison like a company. Some said he walked free under witness protection. Others claimed he was dead. The truth, like everything about Rikers, was murky, buried under bureaucracy and silence. A 2024 investigative report by the city confirmed that, despite dozens of reforms, the same patterns persisted. Gangs still ran phones. Officers still traded favors. And the same unspoken economy thrived in the shadows. Pete's influence had outlasted his presence. His rules, no unnecessary violence, fair trade, balanced power, lingered in the way inmates handled disputes. Even the guards noticed. "It's quieter," one CO reportedly said. Like everyone remembers someone still watching. But Pete was long gone. The larger truth. Pete's story isn't just about one man. It's about a system so broken that it had to create its own leadership to survive. Every riot, every smuggled phone, every corrupt deal, they weren't symptoms of disorder. They were proof of adaptation. Rikers became what the city forced it to be. A self-governed island where crime was the currency of stability. Pete's fall was inevitable, but what came after was more revealing. Reformers finally had evidence of what inmates had always known, that Rikers didn't need more walls. It needed accountability. In 2024, the mayor's office reaffirmed plans to close Rikers by 2027, citing institutional unsustainability. But among the men who'd lived it, few believed. As one former inmate told a reporter, "You can shut down Rikers, but you can't shut down what it taught us." And that's the paradox of Pete's legacy. He exposed a truth so uncomfortable that no one wanted to claim it. The final note. Months after his transfer, an anonymous envelope arrived at the newsroom of the city. Inside were 12 handwritten pages, the same paper used in Rikers Chapel. At the bottom of the final page, one line stood out. "Power isn't what you take. It's what you hold when everyone else lets go." P. The handwriting matched the earlier leak. Pete had found a way to speak again. He vanished from the record after that. No parole hearings. No release notices. Just silence. But on the island he once ruled, every new inmate still hears his name in the whispers that pass between bunks when the lights go out, stories about a man who built peace out of chaos, profit out of fear, and order out of neglect. In a place designed to destroy identity, he became something no one expected, a myth born from truth. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Sources: New York Times, 2023, The City, 2022-2024, NYC Department of Investigation Reports, 2023, NYC Board of Correction Filings, 2021-2024, Federal Court Records, Public DOC Data.